The New York Times versus Sullivan. Argued January 6, 1964. Decided March 9th, 1964. Plaintiff L.B. Sullivan sued the defendant, the New York Times. The plaintiff believed his reputation was damaged due to an ad that contained inaccurate information that was published by the New York Times. The defendant claimed that it authorized publication of the ad because it did not have any reason to believe that its contents were false. The New York Times did not check the accuracy of the statements published, but they did argue that they had no intention of hurting Sullivan and was baffled as to why he thought the ad was about him. The New York Times published the article "Heed Their Rising Voices" on March 29, 1960. After the verdict of this case was decided, freedom of the press changed forever. The New York Times article about the injustices happening to Southern African Americans in the 1960s alleged that the arrest of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for perjury in Alabama was part of a campaign to destroy King's effort to integrate public facilities and encourage blacks to vote. It also alleged that the nonviolent college students who were fighting for their human rights in places like Alabama, Tennessee, and South Carolina were faced with cruel and violent repercussions at the hands of the police department. L.B. Sullivan was one of 3 Montgomery, Alabama police safety commissioners. He sued the New York Times for libel, which means printing something that is false and that can cause harm. L.B. took personal offense to the article that was published supporting the efforts of civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Even though the ad did not mention Sullivan's name directly, he claimed that it implied his responsibility for the actions of the police department in Alabama. Sullivan believed the ad damaged his reputation, and he wanted the New York Times to retract the ad. 2 Alabama courts ruled in favor of Sullivan, and the jury awarded him $500,000 in damages. The New York Times appealed and took their case to the Supreme Court. Defamation is the publication of a false statement about another person that causes that person harm. If a person is suing for defamation, they do not have to be specifically identified in the publication. They only need to be inferred in order to have a case. Libel is written defamation, and it is the most common form. In order to prove libel, the plaintiff must show the following. Publication. At least one person saw or heard the statement. Identification. Prove the statement was about them, the plaintiff. Defamatory statement, whether it's oral or written, shows that the statement exposed them to hatred, ridicule, or scorn. Fault. They have to prove that the statement were published with actual malice. Falsity. They have to prove that the statement is false. And lastly, injury. Usually, if malice is proven, damages to the plaintiff are presumed. The verdict. On March 9th, 1964, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the New York Times. The court ruled that in order to prove libel, a public official must show that the newspaper acted with actual malice, that is, with the knowledge that the statement was false or made with reckless disregard for truth. L.B. Sullivan wasn't able to prove that the statements were made of or concerning him. It was decided that the New York Times had the absolute unconditional right to publish criticisms of the Montgomery agencies and its officials.
On April 5th of 1960, a reporter named Ray Jenkins for the Afternoon Alabama Journal was sitting at his desk having lunch, reading some of the old newspapers in the office. One of them was the week-old New York Times. And so he wrote a 13-paragraph story that said 60 prominent liberals, including former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, have taken out a full-page ad to support the Committee to Defend Martin Luther King and the struggle for freedom in the South. And he reported that the ad described an unprecedented wave of terror in the South. The next day, an editorial writer named Grover Hall for another Montgomery paper saw that and wrote an editorial where he called it Lies, Lies, and Lies, and he compared it to the hysteria and mendacity of the abolitionist agitators prior to the Civil War. Now, maybe I grew up in the wrong part of the country, but I didn't know that the 1960s that the abolitionists were viewed as villainous liars. But his editorial, he urged one of his colleagues to take his editorial downtown and show it around City Hall. Show it to because they've got a good libel case. And that's exactly what happened. Now, how's that for a strange set of events? The most important freedom of press case in the country's history begins with a local reporter writing a news story about a paid ad in an out-of-town newspaper, which prompts an editorial writer to encourage the local city officials to go and file a libel suit. So that's how the Sullivan case actually got underway.
After reviewing this case, I've learned that as a public relations professional, I have to be very careful about the content that I publish and the manner in which I write it. It is very easy to implicate and offend an individual. Even if I don't mention their name directly, or if I'm writing about a corporation as a whole, my wording needs to be appropriate. I must also substantiate all the information that I have in order to avoid any legal actions against me. The New York Times failed to check the accuracy of their Heed Their Rising Voices article. Since all the information wasn't true, Sullivan was able to have a case. Most importantly, I will always make sure that I am in compliance with the laws of the freedom of the press.